goals. As you know, for a decade, the emission gas report has compared where greenhouse gas emissions are heading against where they need to be according to the Paris Agreement, and highlighted the best ways to close this gap. The report is released in the lead-up to the 25th Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that, as you know, will take place from the 2nd to the 13th of December in Spain, where countries will meet to decide upon the next crucial steps in the UN climate change process. As countries are preparing to submit updated or new nationally determined contributions, we hope that the findings of the 2019 emissions gas report will encourage governments, non-state actors, the private sector and local authorities to step up their ambition and commitment towards achieving net zero emission. So in order to hear about these findings, I have the great pleasure to have here a panel of very eminent experts, and I will introduce them to you progressively, but I'll start with Mr. John Christensen, who is the director of the UNEP and Technical University of Denmark Partnership, who is one of the lead authors of the report. He will introduce you to the findings of the report. Mr. Christensen.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just need a little technical assistance on how to move. Good. So we're there now, and thank you very much for the opportunity. Yeah, it should be on. It's just a little far away, and I can't move it any closer. But I will just walk you through some slides very quickly. I only have 10 minutes, and I have too many slides, so some of it is going to be a bit quick. It's all in the report, and you can look into the summary, and you can look into the main report. And I mean, the main message is already on the front page, is that what we're looking at is really that emissions need to go down by 55% by 2030, and that's necessary to keep us on track to the 1.5 degree goal from the Paris Agreement. But I'll come back to where we get that from. And if we start just saying, and we already heard that this is the 10th assessment, we actually produced a little booklet for the Secretary General's Climate Summit in September, summing up the 10 years' experiences. But let's focus on what we're dealing with this year. And essentially what we ask is a series of relatively straightforward questions. What's the trend in emissions? Are countries on track to meet their targets from Paris? Will the plans and targets be enough? Will this be sufficient to stay below 2 degrees or get to the 1.5 degree target that we're looking at? And without emptying the answer already, I mean, there is a gap, and can the gap be bridged? And the second part of the report is always about how to bridge the gap. Every year we cover separate issues. We don't try to cover everything, and I'll tell you a little later on what we look at this year. So essentially, if you look at the global emissions, they are still going up. We had little hope a couple of years ago that the CO2 part of the emissions had basically been stable for a few years, and we hoped that that indicated a stabilization. But in 2017 and 2018, we don't have the 19 numbers yet. Emissions have been going up, and the CO2 emissions have been going up the last year by 2%. So that's actually above the average of the last 10 years. So it's started to increase again, and it doesn't look too good. We then do some more detailed analysis to try and find out where's that growth coming from. And this is a very quick snapshot and the slightly rich slide that is in the report also. But essentially, it's coming because economic growth, especially in developing countries, is really high. And while the OECD countries don't really add to the CO2, they don't really come down a lot either. But the main growth is in developing countries due to economic growth and still relatively high energy and carbon intensity in the energy systems. Another area of concern is the fluorinated gases, but they are being addressed through the Kigali Amendment, so there are already a plan for phasing out those, and we're looking at that in a separate assessment that will come out next year. But essentially, it is a growth coming from the growing economies, which in one way is positive, but as long as it's so carbon intensive, of course, it creates the GHG emissions we don't want. Then we look at, are countries on track to achieve the goals that they've set themselves in Paris? And of course, there's still 10 years till they have to do that, but we're looking at, are they already starting to move towards those targets, and how far have they come? And we basically divided them into 4 categories, and then a 5th one where we don't really know what the answer is. And you can look at the details again. We have a group of countries who are what you would call overperforming compared to their targets. But I think at the same time, you also need to look at were the targets ambitious? So it's not something where you can actually make that. And we don't make a ranking, are countries doing bad or good, because you can be a low performer with a high target and you can be a high performer with a low target. So it's more stated where are they compared to their targets. And then I think that comes back later on when we talk about what's the aim for next year, where there is a chance to come back with new plans and new ambitions. So of course, if you're overachieving, there's no reason not to come back with more ambitious targets next year. Then we start looking at what has become sort of the famous gap figure, and I just want to tell you a little bit how it's done without getting into too much detail. It's quite rich, but what we look at, if you start at the upper end, it's basically a counterfactual policy scenario from 2005. If we had not talked about climate, this is where we would be heading. Because climate has been on the agenda, things have happened, but just not fast enough. We have come back down to the blue one, so we have actually started bending the curve a little bit, but not nearly enough. Then we have the two NDCs, the one on the unconditional, that is what countries have committed to do on their own, and then adding the conditional that developing countries could put up in Paris, saying we can do more if we get help. And that brings it down to the level that's indicated by this kind of orange. And then we have to compare to it what it would take in 2030 according to sort of IPCC scenarios, what it would take to be on track to 1.5, 1.8, and 2.0 to try and differentiate that picture, because there's nothing magic about each of them. I mean, it's about getting as far down as we can. And then we compare the things and look at, if we are looking at the 2-degree target of just around 2 degrees, we have a gap of 12 to 15 gigatons. And if we're looking at the 1.5 degree, which is really the desirable one, we have a gap of around 30 gigatons. And 30 gigatons is more than half of what we emit now. And that's why we need to come down by 55% in 10 years. If that's something you can do if you're waiting, if you're not starting right away, there's simply no way to bend that curve. And it's a scary figure. It's really, really high. But I think it's what we need to do if we want to be on track to the 1.5 degree. And there's been 2 IPCC reports coming out this year telling us about what will happen if we don't, and what will happen already with the 1.5 degree. And especially the one on cryosphere and oceans about ice and snow is, in my view, really, really scary in terms of the impacts coming. So then we're looking at what countries are doing. We saw for the summit I mentioned before in September that a number of countries have come up and said we will come up with new enhanced climate plans, NDCs, for next year, and also that we will commit to 2050 zero emissions plans. But if you look at it, it's an okay number, but it's mainly outside of the G20, and G20 constitutes on emissions about 78% of global emissions. And most of the ones that committed to new plans next year and to zero carbon emissions are not in the G20. A few of them are, but not a lot. And then we looked in detail at G20 countries this year, and also have to say that a lot of the plans that have been discussed about have not really been acted on yet. It doesn't mean that there's not positive things happening in many of the countries, but they're not living up to the targets that we all think they should be doing. On the second part of the report, we are looking at, we are actually talking about something where we talk about transformational change now. I mean, incremental changes will simply not make it. And I think that's an important point to make, is that we really need to transform societies in these 10 years. And we're looking at a lot of areas where that can be done and how to do it. And I haven't got time to go in detail. I'll just show you one slide to illustrate maybe an extreme transformational change, but one that we've all experienced. If you look at when I tell my kids about how you were phoning when I was a kid, they look at me like I was just somebody who fell off the moon or whatever. Suddenly it went over to the exchange, they put in the plug, and now it's all in one little gadget. You have the TV, you have the radio, you have movie, you have everything else. And if you look at what that means in terms of, for instance, energy consumption, material consumption, and so on, it's staggering. I'm not saying you can do the same kind of transitions in all kinds of other areas. This is unique. But it just illustrates that we are experiencing transitions. And if you look historically at it, there's been a lot of transitions on transport, rails, shipping, and so on. And we are right now looking also at a transition, for instance, on electrical mobility, which is quite unique compared to anything we've seen before. Then we look in details at the energy system, because, together with nature-based solutions and the whole green area, which we've looked at in earlier reports, the energy system transition or transformation is really key to the success on climate mitigation. And I think there are maybe it's unfair, but to call them easy wins on the renewable expansion. I mean, wind and solar have in the last few years become so cheap that they're fully competitive with fossil fuels in almost all situations. It would require some system adjustments. It may also need some storage and some other things, but essentially it's something which is technically possible, and right now it's cost competitive in most cases. Then we have the coal phase-out issue, and that's not just an energy sector issue, that's really a social change issue and a transformation of countries. It's part of the economy. I always use the example we had 2 years ago that in India more than 1 million people work in coal. So it's not just about changing the energy part, it's also changing employment and the way you engage in what you call a just transition right now. Decarbonizing transport, it links back to power. I think transport, at least sort of person transport, trains and so on, really need to be electrified where they're not, and also that links, of course, with a challenge to the power sector, but it needs to come with energy efficiency improvements, of course, at the same time. But that's doable, the technologies are on the way, and I think in a few years we will see that transition happening very strongly. In some countries it already is. And here it's interesting to see that China and India are among the leads simply because they're driven by other things than climate. Local air pollution has driven that process in China very strongly. I think you have more than 100 two-wheelers on electricity right now, and they're starting to move very fast on person cars also. And India is coming also driven by local air pollution issues. And I think then what we realize is that some of the heavy energy industry is going to be a real challenge, because there you need really high temperatures and so on that can be hard to do. And then we combine it also with the energy access, the leapfrogging. If you look at the people who need to get access, I mean, you can help them in a way that you don't need to go through the carbon route before you actually get to the renewable and the clean one. And that is happening in a lot of places also. The final one here is just to illustrate the prices that I talked about before with wind and solar and the range of fossil fuels. And it is really happening. I was in Brazil a couple of months ago for the Regional Climate Week, sitting on a panel with 2 private bankers, and they were essentially investing money in solar power plants in Brazil and making money and being really happy about it. So a lot of the stories about being expensive is really historical and is a myth. It's simply because people don't know what the current market cost of these technologies are. The final one, we take a new kind of approach to try and look at resource efficiency, and we specifically look at material production and consumption and look at what is the possibility if you get into that, and looking at, can we produce materials more efficiently, can we use less of it, and can we also use it more intelligently. And if you look at the scale of it here in terms of greenhouse gases associated with material productions, we are talking about something which is really at a scale that matters. So it's something where we can make a difference. And in the report, we look at different areas where you can then do it. And this one is then for the transport sector with more efficient use of materials in car, more efficient use of cars, and also downsizing, and also, you would say, reuse and recycling of materials. So it makes really significant contributions in terms of mitigation, which you don't see if you look just at the sectors. So I think that is an important angle to add to the normal sectoral approach. I'm sorry, this is a bit fast, but that's the way it is. And that gets us to sort of the final messaging. So, I mean, what are the trends right now is that we see emissions growing. We don't see any peaking happening right now. We look for it every year, but we were hoping, as I said a few years ago. I think we had what was called the Cancun pledges that was done about 10 years ago. I think overall the countries that had pledges are meeting them, but they are very modest compared to where we need to go. If we look at the NDC targets, as I showed you before, many of the countries are not on track yet. Some are, but some are also just because the goals that they've set themselves were not very high. And if we look at the contributions, I mean, the NDCs will contribute 4 to 6 gigatons if fully implemented by 2030. And what we're looking at is for the 2 degree to be realized 12 to 15, and this sort of around 30 gigatons, which is more than 5 times the current ambitions of the NDCs. So countries, next year is the first chance to revise and enhance the NDCs and the plans. And countries really need to step up, because if it's not starting from 2020, seeing some serious action plus some ambitious plan, there's just no way we're going to make it. Final one, will this be enough to stay on track? I mean, the answer is almost given. I think if we're looking at just implementing the NDCs and not raising ambitions, then the predictions here says that we're aiming between 3 and 3.2 degrees, and that's really a world you don't want to experience. And I think being a grandfather also, you don't want to leave that for your grandkids. I mean, you would be ashamed of yourself if you knew the trouble they'll get into. And of course, also, if you turn that into the carbon dioxide budget, if we haven't moved further by 2030, 1.5 degrees is gone. I mean, it's not worth talking about. The positive part is we try to show that there are lots of opportunities for countries to do this, and also that while it is transformational, a lot of it can happen in ways that also benefit a lot of the other SDGs, and it just needs to be done in you could say, the smart or the right way. On the energy side, power systems will be key to the energy sector decarbonization, and you need to move a lot of the services over to power. And as I said before, material efficiency can make really important contributions, and we need to focus in on that in a different way than we've been doing so far. That's it. I'm going to leave this one up because maybe it's what we're going to talk about. So if you don't mind, I'll just leave that on it right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Christensen. And now I will let the heads of the leading UN agencies and programs engaged in the fight against climate change to give you some insights of the report in light of their organizational work. Let me start with Mrs. Inger Andersen, Executive Director of the UN Environment Programme since January of this year. I'm particularly happy to have Mrs. Andersen here, as I understand this is the first press briefing to the Geneva Press Corps in her capacity as UNEP's Executive Director. Mrs. Andersen, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all. Essentially, what we have seen in this report and what you are seeing, that at this time, had we acted in 2010, we would have had to reduce our emissions by 3.2% a year, by 3.3% a year. Now, because of climate procrastination, which we have essentially had during these 10 years, we are looking at a 7.6% reduction every year. Is that possible? Absolutely. Will it take political will? Yes. Will we need to have the private sector lean in? Yes. But the science tells us that we can do this. And the opportunities are there, but failure is simply not an option. If we don't do this, we already saw in the IPBES report that came out earlier in this year that out of the 7.8 million species that we have on this planet, 1 million is threatened by extinction, in part also due to climate change. We understand that at 1.5 degrees, 70% of the coral reefs will die. At 2 degrees, practically all coral reefs disappear. We understand that insects that we need for pollination to have our food production will be significantly impacted, and we are likely to lose massive habitats and therefore insects at the higher level. And all of that, of course, impacts on livability and on poverty reduction. So at this point, the opportunities to decarbonize is very real. Decarbonizing our energy supply. Our Secretary General has called for phasing out of coal, which we can see clearly from the numbers before you is critical. We call for green industrialization target and net zero energy buildings and construction, as well as, obviously, as we so do, also invest in nature and nature's opportunity to provide us with that buffer, the nature-based solutions during the time when we are decarbonizing. This 10 years, which has to be a massive effort on decarbonization by ensuring restoration of degraded ecosystems as well as protecting standing forests, we can get a break from nature that will help us, give us a leg up while we are taking carbon out of our energy supply. Nature will help us taking it up into its biomass. So clearly, we all have a responsibility. The biggest emitters, and the numbers are there, have an opportunity, but the small emitters too, and we were very proud to see in the Action Summit that a number of countries stepped up and committed to it was some 60 countries committed to net zero by 2050, and it was 70 countries making a commitment on stretched NDCs in 2020. These are leaders, and we encourage others to step into their wake. As we make these transitions, what will be absolutely critical is that we do do not leave anyone behind, that we ensure that there is social cushions and space so that those that might otherwise be hit by hikes or by shifts in the economy are protected in such a way that this becomes a fair transition, a safe transition, a transition that leaves no one behind. The bottom line here is that this is doable. It is a massive lift. Had we done it 10 years ago, it would have been easier. But we still have the time. And that the time is now, and the opportunity is now, as Paris Accord will go into effect, as we head towards Madrid, as we need to see that lift from 2020 through 2030, where the SDGs have to come to their fruition, as well as the Paris Accord agreements 2040-2050. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Anderson. And I will now give the floor to Petteri Talas. Mr. Talas, a distinguished researcher and professor in the field of ozone studies and remote sensing, has been Secretary General of the World Meteorological Organization since January 2016. Mr. Talas, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you and good morning. I think that we met many of you yesterday when we published the greenhouse gas report showing that we have already seen 46% increase of carbon dioxide since the pre-industrial times and 157% increase in methane concentrations. And methane is contributing 17% to the warming that we have observed. There seems to be a gap also between the speeches of the heads of state and the reality in the country level, what was also visible today. And we have seen growth in the consumption of gas, petroleum, and for the past 2 years also in the consumption of coal, which is not very good news. And 85% of the global energy is based on fossil ones, and only 15% based on nuclear, hydro, and renewables. And we should revert those numbers to be successful in implementation of the Paris Agreement. The energy demand globally is still growing, and that's very much following the economic growth that we have seen, for example, during the past 2 years, and the energy demand is especially growing in less developed countries. And it would be great to comfort that need with non-fossil sources of energy. Nuclear energy price is fairly high. It's not very attractive for the investors, although it would be a very good climate-friendly way of producing energy. This is also a generation issue. The youth is moving worldwide, and there's a very good reason for that. It's a question whether we think of economic growth for the coming couple of years, or whether we think of the economy and welfare of the coming decades, or even coming centuries. And this youth movement is growing, and it's very well understood why that is happening. There's clearly a need to raise the ambition level of Paris Agreement implementation, and that's the tone in the whole UN system, as my colleague Ingrid just said. And we are moving towards 3 to 5 degrees warming by the end of this century, instead of 1.5 to 2, which was the Paris target. And if we use all of the known fossil energy sources, we would reach 8 degrees warmer planet. Despite of this negative news, also hope exists. We have means to solve this problem, and the prices of solar and wind energy, they have become attractive for the investors, and we have started seeing growing investments in those sources of energy. Consumers are becoming more aware of carbon footprint of the products that they are buying, and that may have an impact on certain countries where the basis of energy production is very much fossil. And the consumers are also interested in finding savings, and the governments have started offering them win-win solutions where they can save money, and we can reach climate-friendly solutions. And health is also becoming more important, and conversion of the transport system an energy system to carbon neutral, we could also improve the air quality, which is a major challenge in many countries. In European Union countries, there's also trade incentive to become carbon neutral because Europe is a fossil sparse area, and there's an attraction to use that money somewhere else than buying fossil energy from outside of European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Talas. And now I have the pleasure to give the floor to Abdallah Moqsit. Mr. Moqsit is the Secretary of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and has held a number of leadership positions both internationally, particularly with the World Meteorological Organization, and his country, Morocco, where he headed local institutions dealing with meteorology. So you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I am really honored to be in this podium, and there are many symbols in this podium because I saw that many outcomes from our report are already highlighted in the GAP report itself. But what I want to highlight is that the symbolic thing is IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, is the baby of two parent organizations, the World Meteorological Organization and UN Environment. And thanks to them, all what we have as a result from IPCC is thanks to our parent organization. They are doing a great job for us. Now, as other symbol, it's about the year 2019. And this year, for IPCC, is the most intense year in the life, in 31 years in the history of IPCC, because we delivered 3 reports. We approved 3 reports. 2 of them are related to climate change and land, and the second is related to ocean cryosphere in changing climate. And both these reports provided a clear message that we should act. This is added to special report about 1.5 that highlighted all the necessary action to be taken if you want to be under this anomaly of temperature 1.5. Another symbol is coming from policymaker perspective. If I am Prime Minister, I will be really happy this year to see that, because there is very important raise of ambition. It starts from the United Nations Secretary General Climate Summit, followed by these 3 reports coming from IPCC, followed by this 10th GAP report, and also followed by the gas bulletin just launched yesterday, as well as the preparation for the global annual climate report. What it means, if I am policymaker, I have all the information that can allow me to take action. Those reports now, and this is also symbolic, they are prepared in coordinated manner, seeking the maximum of coherency, and also providing this continuity. I mean 3C. Why? Because if I am policymaker, IPCC reports are coming each 6 years, 7 years. While the GAP report is coming yearly. The gas bulletin is coming yearly, and as well as the global climate status coming 1 year. And this is also prepared in such a way that all the agencies are involved to provide the same information without any overlap, without any ambiguity. The last thing I want to highlight, and this is also related to GAP as well as the future information, is now it is time to simplify the messages to be sent to all these policymakers. And I'm happy to highlight to you that there are some messages, key messages that we can put in the back of visit card. But not only this. My hope, and I was coming from WMO, and I said that it can have rather to prepare a soft accordion in which page we can put not only IPCC key messages. We will have key messages from IPCC, key messages for a GAP report, key messages for global climate statement, and also from the gas bulletin. This can help decision makers to take action. And time of action is now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moksit. And I finally would like to introduce to you Ms. Katia Simeonova, who's the coordinator of the subsidiary body for implementation of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. She is also the manager of the Transparency Framework subprogram within the Mitigation Data and Analysis program of the Convention Secretariat, and she is responsible for cooperation with international organizations, in particular for the preparation of the emission gas report. Ms. Simonova, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. It's an honor for me to be today with you and to be part of this distinguished panel at the launch of the landmark UNEP GAP report. Let me start by stressing that the science is clear. The world is facing climate emergency. This is an existential crisis and represents the greatest challenge that are facing by this and future generations. A global challenge of this magnitude cannot be solved by governments alone. It requires involvement and engagement of all segments of societies, business, investors, cities, states, regions, and general population. Together, we must provide true transformational change, change that will not only create greener, safer, and healthier future, but also a change that would unleash the huge potential for green growth and innovation. This year, we celebrate the 10th anniversary of the UNEP Emission Gap Report. In the past decade, based on solid scientific evidence, this report has provided strong and growing message that we must significantly boost climate ambition as the gap between the emission levels and the 1.5-degree goal is widening. The report has increasingly warned us that we are dangerously close to the tipping point when we would have exhausted the available carbon budget. The 2019 report shows clearly that the unprecedented scale of climate action that is urgently needed to close the ambition gap is not happening yet. The report also shows that instead emissions are growing by an average of 1.5 degrees in the last decade, and they show any sign of peaking. While previous reports showed very clearly that the mitigation potential exists that could be sufficient, even more than sufficient, to close the ambition gap, the 2019 report provides comprehensive options and solutions how to do this. Firstly, as John Christiansen highlighted, the report provides comprehensive overview of the recent ambitious climate actions by national and subnational governments as well as non-state actors, zooming into G20 members. Secondly, the report identifies transformational changes that are absolutely critical to align global trends with the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement as well as the Sustainable Development Goals by zooming into global transformation of the energy systems and enhancing material efficiencies in building sectors and in cars. The UNEP GAP report has been instrumental in the last 10 years in enabling parties under the UNFCCC to take best possible decisions based on the best available science when both adopting and implementing the Paris Agreement. We expect that this year's report message of urgency to boost climate action will resonate well among parties and other stakeholders and will hopefully result in more ambitious NDCs and long-term strategies to be submitted in 2020. In concluding, I would like to stress that 2020 is our last best chance to turn the tide. But we are not in Glasgow at COP26 yet. We are in Madrid at COP25. Important decisions must be taken at COP25 in order to pave the way for higher ambition in 2020. To that end, I would like to recall only two of the major tasks that need to be fulfilled by COP25. The first is continuing to boost climate ambition and the second is concluding negotiations on Article 6 on cooperative implementation. We encourage all nations to use this year's UNEP-GAP report to boost the collective climate ambition that we urgently needed, and in capitalizing on the outcome of the UN SG Summit on climate ambition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Simonova. And now I would like to open the floor to questions. Please state your name and media and tell us to whom you are addressing your question. Who would like to start? John.
Yes, good morning, John Zarakostis for Penske Media and also The Lancet. My first question is to the principal author of the report, Mr. Christensen, I think. I was wondering, so if you could elaborate, what would be, if you've done the numbers, the technology transfer component to help countries that are not in a position to make the transition and to mitigate a way to be able to have energy efficient systems and lower CO2 levels. If I recall rightly, this number was crunched during the global warming summit in Brazil in 1992. What are today's numbers? Have you done this? Thank you.
Sir, yeah, we normally answer every question directly.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't done exactly the numbers that you're asking for, certainly not in the report this year. As I said, we cover different aspects of the possibilities in the second part of the report. But I think, as I said already in my presentation when I was in Brazil in August, I mean, technologies are to a large extent moving through private sector investments. So, I mean, it is something where, as I said, on renewables, the market is so that essentially countries are implementing renewables around the world, and you see that in many developing countries also. I think in addition there is, of course, under the convention a number of mechanisms like the Green Climate Fund, the Climate Technology Center Network and so on that have been set up to help on technology transfer and to help developing countries access to technology. So I think the mechanisms are there. I don't think that there's any sort of dramatic blockage in terms of what countries have access to on technology that's preventing them from moving. I don't think that is the main issue, really.
I've got a follow-up. I'm intrigued in your report. You make a reference to consumption-based emissions, and basically that flips the numbers for developed countries when you include them. Can you elaborate a little bit how that would impact consumption in rich countries if that was widely included in the purchase of products?
Yeah, I think that's a movement that you're seeing, and next year we're going to also look at behavioral change and personal consumption issues in the report we're planning for next year to get into more detail with it. But we included that for the first time in the report this year to illustrate that there is the carbon footprint, the embedded carbon that is not part of the national emissions per se, but is part of what you're importing from other places. I think what we saw is, of course, that in some cases it shifts the balance in terms of per capita emissions, because we gave the example in EU and China where the Chinese direct emissions per capita have now sort of grown over the EU ones, but if you look at the embedded carbon and the ones in the product, that shifts the balance somewhat back to the situation where EU consumption is higher. What we've seen at the same time is that actually about 10 years ago that gap was growing, but the last period here it's actually been shrinking a little bit, so you can say the embedded carbon, the carbon footprinting is actually shrinking a little bit in recent years because a lot of production is returning to the industrialized countries also, plus also that the countries that are producing things are getting more efficient at the same time.
Emma.
Emma Farge from Reuters. I was just wondering if you could kindly elaborate a little bit more on potential higher temperature scenarios this century. In what scenario would those occur, and what temperatures are possible, and how likely is that? Thank you.
Please.
Yeah, so of course this depends on how we are going to be successful with the mitigation. So that's a key driver, of course, and it's theoretically possible to reach 1.5, but that would mean very ambitious mitigation means, and also to reach 2 degrees we would need very ambitious mitigation efforts, not as stringent as the 1.5. And if we don't do anything, the range is going to be from 3 to 5 degrees by the end of this century.
Anybody would like to answer? Mrs. Sanders?
Well, just to add that scenario that my colleague highlighted, the high scenario clearly would have catastrophic impacts on the human environment. And so understanding then what that means in real terms is not, I referred to insects and coral reefs, but let's also think about likelihood of greater intensity of storms, shorter rainy seasons, therefore not in accord with the time needed for harvest, for harvest to ripen, especially in some of the most drought-stressed or severity on desertification-stressed regions. So the impact there, and therefore that impact on people who are already living in marginal settings, is clearly one to be mindful of. Then there is a whole issue around sea ice and what that does, obviously in terms of sea level rises, where today 6 million people currently in coastal areas are vulnerable at the 1.5 degrees. But if we were to move that at 2 degrees, 10 million people, and obviously as it goes up, more people would not have the ability to live safely in their current habitat. So that is one dimension that we need to take on board from those higher temperature scenarios.
Yeah, perhaps we are a little bit too much stick to the temperatures only, because most of the impacts of climate change are not related only to temperature. The main impact so far and also by the end of this century is coming from the changes in rainfall patterns, and we have started seeing already some of the regions to become more dry, especially Africa and southern parts of Asia and some parts of Americas, and that's having even bigger impact than the temperature changes. With the 3 degrees, we would lose already a fairly big fraction of the current yield, and areas like Africa, where the population is growing, would really suffer because of that. And that's, to me, the main concern related to climate change. Sea level rise happens fairly slowly. It's the magnitude is about half meter to 1 meter per century, and so. But that's one factor which will happen in the long term. But in the short term, these changes in rainfall patterns is to me the main matter of concern.
Mr. Christensen?
Yeah, just adding a few points. I was going to say some of the same things, is that I think people tend to forget that there is the long-term trend with the higher temperatures, then there's the catastrophic events, but then, as we just heard, there's also the increased variability that you see. I come from Denmark, and that's a fairly robust climate, but last fall we had the biggest drought in 50 years. This year we had the wettest fall in 150 years. So if you check with the Met Office in your own country and look at how many small extremes you have, I did it once, and I think we break a record almost every second month. It could be the driest, the sunniest, the coldest, the windiest, whatever. It's just indicated that the amplitude goes up with the temperature. So we have all these small disasters, and as we just heard from Mr. Talas, is that in more vulnerable climates, and especially in the tropical areas, this is really disasters without being called a disaster. I mean, this is just variability, but it becomes a disaster if your harvest doesn't work out that year, then the family doesn't have any food. So, I mean, that is really happening in the short term. I think if you look at the IPCC 1.5 degree, one of the things I really liked about it is they had a very detailed description about what's the difference between 1.5 degree and 2 in terms of impacts. And I think that's why when we talk about this, 1.5 degree becomes kind of a magic number. And I think 1.5 degree has nothing magic about it. It's a political target, but if we don't reach that, the lower we get, the less impacts we will have. So I think it's not about if we miss that, then everything is gone. But it is a good target to have because it's the one that they document and have the lowest level impact compared to where we are now. Of course, if we could stop things right now, that would be great, but that's not the way the world works.
Emma, you had a follow-up.
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify, Secretary General Talas, you said between 3 to 5 degrees, right? Thank you.
Laurent.
Laurent Siro, Swiss News Agency. So you mentioned that important meeting next year in Glasgow, but I think it was a news release that you even say still we cannot postpone action until that gathering. So I'd like to know what kind of concrete action you expect in the next year from the member states, and what reasonable target you can establish for the next GAP report before that 2020 important meeting. And there will be also an important political campaign in the biggest economy in the world, in the US. So you think we're going to be able to make it if there isn't a reverse in the commitment or the absence of commitment, which is made by the biggest economy in the world?
Maybe I'll start on the concrete actions and then I'll ask John to come in. On the concrete actions, I think what we are looking for, and as we mentioned, we are looking for countries that have already submitted their NDCs to re-look at them voluntarily, as well as in view of their commitments under the Convention, to see how they can stretch. This is about being more ambitious on the high carbon emitting industries that they may have and the high carbon emitting power sectors that they have. We need to see a shift away from high carbon emissions in all fields. That includes obviously power, but it also deals with the shipping, it deals with transport in general, it deals with cement production, it deals with building and industry. And each of these, there are opportunities. There are opportunities with the existing plants, be it cement or be it buildings and infrastructure, and there are opportunities with new plants that you have coming online, making sure and seeking to use non-carbon emission or low-carbon emission technologies. And that is clear, and we are seeing that, but we are not seeing the shift, and we want to, as fast as we would like. At the same time, we know that there's still a considerable amount of commissioning on new coal power plants. We understand that these are online to meet power demands, but we are hoping and encouraging countries to look at alternatives where these exist. Meanwhile, obviously, we would want to see as much investments in R&D as possible to ensure that we can move towards nighttime storage, longer time storage, etc., etc. That technology has moved fairly fast, but we need it to move even faster. So encouraging that through any means and all means by government or private sector is important. As individuals, we have a choice also in how we live, what we eat, and how we go about our business. And there, I think that whilst there are interesting studies around this, so that we can, as the embedded carbon footprint in our consumption, to which John just referred, as well as our own lifestyles, we have choices to make and opportunities to live a lower carbon life. Now with John on the next year's emissions gap report.
Mr. Christensen, you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, on that, of course, I think what is important is, of course, that countries come with new plans. But as Inger just said, I mean, it's about action. So coming with a plan next year is not enough. You have to start doing something, both enhancing what you've already started implementation of the current one. But of course, it's also important to show that you're committing yourself to a higher target. In that way, you can lift the common sort of commitment by all the countries, because I think one of the things around Paris is everybody submitted without knowing what the other ones were doing. So there's a natural sort of human tendency to come in and be discreet in the first go. Now you've seen what everybody's doing. We've been telling countries many times that they need to raise ambition. So of course we expected them to do that, because otherwise the whole agreement is not credible. I think what we'll be doing during the next year is to look at them. Last time we did it together with Katja in parallel to try and see what comes in, because countries don't submit it necessarily by Glasgow. I think already in Madrid you'll see Chile as the COP host officially submitting their NDC. They have prepared it, it's been out for hearing, it's very ambitious, and they really want to set the standard for what other countries will do. And I think maybe on the flip side of it, also be aware that in the UN Environment Programme, we work with countries on NDC implementation. We work on all these practical stuff. We help them come with efficient light bulbs, efficient air conditioners, district heating, renewable energy, and that's something we do, of course, beyond all this gap report. That we are working to support countries, and so is the rest of the UN family. It's not just UN Environment. We are a small actor here, and the big banks and whatever. So there is a lot of support, a lot of action out there, but it's just not moving fast enough. That's the point.
Mrs. Simonova.
As I have mentioned already, next year in 2020 we expect expect countries to submit their new or updated NDCs and long-term strategies. When parties decided in Paris on the nationally determined contributions, they were looking at them as the main vehicle or the mechanism to implement the Paris Agreement. And some countries submitted such NDCs that had 5 years and the other that had 10 years implementation period. So those countries that have 5 years, then by 2020 they will submit new NDCs, and those that have 10 years will hopefully revisit their NDCs and increase their ambition. In both cases, if what is essential is to follow the principle of the Paris Agreement of no backsliding. Secondly, we expect in 2020 parties to submit also the long-term strategies. These are incredibly important instruments that set the long-term direction of economy and society. And what came out of the UNSG event is, on my view, a game changer. This is the pledge by 60 countries to ensure net zero in 2050. This sets a very clear destination within which the NDCs, which are kind of short-term measures, should be aligned. And at the end of the day, it's also important to recall that we have a global stocktake under the Paris Agreement that looks at the collective ambition. It will take place for the first time in 2023, and it will be preceded by hopefully increased reporting and transparency under the Paris Agreement, which provides one of the essential inputs on how countries are doing with the implementation of their commitments under the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Mr. Thaler.
Yeah, first of all, it's, we have to have a global effort to solve this problem. We cannot sub-optimize it, and that's why United Nations mechanism is crucially needed. But it's already clear that so far this mechanism hasn't been a success story, and that's why in the UN family we have started action, and we organized the Climate Action Summit in New York two months ago, and we got some new initiatives from the countries. And what seems to be the case is that the countries would, many of the countries would benefit from external support for their planning. The pledges that they made as part of the Paris deal haven't been fulfilled, and one has to make such plans which are realistic and also politically accepted. So that's this political acceptance is one of the challenges that many governments are facing, and that was seen also here in France as part of the Gilets jaunes movement. And the other thing where we might improve the situation is that so far the process has been very much in the hands of ministries for environment in the countries, and in many countries ministries for environment are not the politically most powerful players, and there's a movement to get also ministers for finance, trade and industry and transport on board, which have more power at the country level, and that's this kind of wider perspective at the country level would also be beneficial for the process.
Gabriela.
Thank you very much, Gabriela Sotomayor, Mexico, Proceso. To Mrs. Anderson or whoever wants to answer, how relevant to the conference is the fact that the U.S. government has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement? Although American society is taking action, many countries could see this decision as an insult, or other governments could follow Mr. Trump. So, can you answer this?
It's obviously relevant that a country has taken that decision, and that's why it has been of such newsworthiness. But having said that, though, what all other parties are saying is they're sticking with Paris. That's an important element so far, and we are very pleased that even in countries where the social impact, as Mr. Thaler was talking about, have at times been complex, we've not seen a walking away. I think that we understand that the social impact is a dimension that is part of the conversation, which is why the leaving no one behind and cushioning those elements in society that might be impacted by these shifts that we need to see in society and economy are safeguarded. So clearly what we do see in the U.S. is, as you rightly mentioned, a commitment at the state and city level, which we are very pleased about. And we obviously hope that and call on that that kind of commitment is retained. In the longer run, this is a universal convention, and we know, especially from UNEP's side, that multilateralism works. The Ozone Protocol that we just had its meeting of parties is one of these great successes showing the success of multilateralism. Had it not been for that protocol, we would have been 25% warmer, and we would have got sunburned in 5 minutes. So the bottom line here is stay at the table, negotiate, engage, and ensure that we together can move forward on climate action, and encouraging, obviously, the U.S. to, at all times, reconsider as we go forward. Thank you.
Mr. Thalas.
Yeah, there may be a little bit the misunderstanding behind the Paris Agreement. So the Paris pledges were made to countries by themselves on voluntary basis. There was no external pressure that USA should commit to something. So it was their own announcement. So that's the nature of the Paris Agreement. And as Inger said, there has been also quite good progress in USA. Several states and several cities are proceeding, and for example, California and Florida, they have very ambitious mitigation targets, and so far USA has fulfilled half of its Paris pledges. So things are moving, and in many parts of the country, it's attractive to invest in solar and wind energy, where you get the maximum economic benefit. So that's the situation. The image is different from the reality in the country.
Jan.
Yes, good morning. Jan Herbermann with German language media. I'd also like to ask you on Madrid and the position of the US government. And do you think that the Paris Agreement and the fight against global climate change could survive a second term of President Trump in office?
Well, this is, well, you know, obviously it will. Multilateralism is what it is, and United Nations stands firmly behind that and behind the blue flag that all countries have signed up to. And on Paris, we have 10 states that have declared we are still in. We have nearly 300 cities that have declared they're still in. You have faith groups and tribes and cultural institutions and businesses. So this is a reality. We have to accept that there are political views in the United States on this. However, the science does speak, and therefore it's important that we have had the IPCC reports that highlight the realities, and thus the other countries are indeed committed, will be turning up in Madrid, and were very present in the Secretary General's Climate Action Summit, seeking to lean in and to make the stretches that we need.
Madam, yes, if you could introduce yourself.
I'm Yuki from NHK Japanese TV. I have two questions to Mrs. Andersen. It might overlap what you have mentioned already, but first one is, could you elaborate what you expect from the COP in Madrid next week? And the second one is country-specific, but in order to mitigate the emission, what do you expect for Japan, for example, shutting down coal-fired power station? Thank you.
Mr. Christensen.
Well, I mean, to be honest, I need to go back and check on specifically on Japan. I haven't looked at that, so maybe I can come back to you on that afterwards. I mean, there are a little bit of, we issued a special report on G20 for the summit in September, where there was quite a detailed analysis of most of the G20 countries, including Japan. And there's a little bit of a summary in the report this time, but to be honest, I mean, I haven't read up on it, but if you look at it in the main report, when you get it, I mean, it's basically focusing on carbon pricing, developing a new energy strategy and plan, given the changes that have happened in Japan around the nuclear issue and increasingly also moving towards solar and so on. So, I mean, it's very much focusing on that, plus, as Inga mentioned, zero energy buildings and net zero energy housing and so on. So there are lots of recommendations that have been put in there, but of course it's up to countries to choose their own path about how they want to go about it. We just highlight some of the areas that is high potential, and I think the energy sector, given the changes happening, I think it is the one to focus on right now.
Manabe, on the first question.
As I have mentioned already, in terms of COP25, we have two major tasks to deliver. One is to increase ambition, and the other is to complete negotiations on Article 6. We expect that Japan will be part of the solution in both of these tasks and will continue to show leadership in terms of increasing ambition, and will try to offer some solutions that could help to get the rules and modalities for the implementation of Article 6, which is essentially on cooperative implementation, in such format that would help to boost the global ambition and provide other opportunities for all countries to engage under the Paris Agreement in order to ensure what Ms. Anderson mentioned already, that no one is left behind.
Yes, Jamie.
Good morning, I'm Jamie from Associated Press. Mr. Christensen, I believe in one of the slides that you showed up earlier talked about some countries that have made targets that maybe are underestimated in the fact that they could do more. I think I saw in there that Russia and Turkey were among them. Could you be specific beyond those three countries? I think I saw Russia and Turkey, but which countries specifically have underestimated their targets and could do more?
I mean, I think you can find Climate Tracker and others that do that online. I mean, as the UN, we don't sort of name and shame countries. So, I mean, in that sense, we're just saying that given that some of these countries are overperforming in a very short period of time, and when you look at their targets that they've set themselves in the indices and compare them with what you would call a business as usual. So if you have a target for 2030 that is lower than where you would be heading normally, then I would say the plan is not very ambitious. But if we don't go into sort of individual countries and do that, that's simply not the name of the game.
The reason I asked that is because it was on your slide. I mean, you actually had the names of the countries on your slide. So I'm just trying, I understand that you don't want to name and shame countries. I get that, right? But on the other hand, there are opportunities, and with UN's encouragement, if you will, you could probably call on countries that maybe have underperformed to do more. So I'm just wondering, could you just help us elaborate? Is it just those three countries, or are there others? Thank you.
I mean, what you saw on the slide is the ones that are overperforming compared to their targets. Huh? So, I mean, and then you can turn the argument around and say, if they're actually performing, doesn't matter whether the target is up there or not, because if they're actually doing things irrespective of that they have a lower target, then that's still positive. So I think we would just encourage them to do more. And of course, I think given that they're already doing much more than they've said in their target, I don't see any reason why they shouldn't come with a new plan with higher targets, because they're already doing it.
On the slide.
Sorry?
And those countries are?
No, I mean, yeah, I mean, I can. The three ones that are heavily overperforming is Turkey, India, and Russia, and then we have a smaller, well, a similar group of countries that are sort of just on the positive side of NDC. And we've had long discussions, for instance, with the EU. Are they just on track? Are they just under track? And I think 2 out of 3 studies says that they were on track, and the third one saying they were just below. Depends on the assumptions about full implementation and so on. But of course, countries are very keen to see themselves in here and what we say about them. But we don't say whether it's a good or bad target. That's not our job.
Thank you very much. I don't know if you want to do any closing comments, any of our speakers. So thank you very, very much to our speakers today. I we really wish you good luck with the work in Madrid. And I would like to invite the correspondent to stay here because in 5 minutes we have our regular press briefing. Thank you very much to everybody. Have a nice day.